Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster Bundle. Available on Nintendo Switch, PlayStation platforms, and Steam. Retailing for $74.99, which saves a little over $20 versus buying them individually. This is a collection of the most recent remakes of Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These remakes are in theory meant to be the definitive versions of these 6 games. Definitive in that they remove any extra content that has been added in other remakes over the years to try and preserve some semblance of what it was like playing these games the first time. How successful they were at that goal does vary greatly between the 6 games. For example, the original Final Fantasy does have a number of quality of life improvements over the original 8-bit version. Your characters will never swing at an enemy that's already dead, and you are not limited to only 9 casts of any level of spell. And of course, they've made all weapons, spells, and items actually work as intended, meaning the original Final Fantasy in this collection bears very little resemblance to its original 8-bit form. While on the other hand, Final Fantasy 4 and 6 do look slightly nicer than they did back on the Super Nintendo. They play very close to their 16-bit incarnations, but have received a better translation than they had back in the 16-bit days. Of course, we didn't receive Final Fantasy 2, 3, and 5 until years after the fact here in the States. And then it wasn't on original hardware, it was already enhanced versions on the PlayStation 1, and then again on the Game Boy Advance. And it is a little harder for me to critique them versus their originals for that reason, as versions of Final Fantasy V I played had more classes to choose from by the end of the game, but those were classes I personally never found particularly useful, so I can't really say that I missed them in this version. This is a collection very much aimed at the Final Fantasy fanbase, and even though some of these have been made easier than their original counterparts, they are still 8 and 16-bit RPGs, meaning that these games will be a bit obtuse at times, and of course will require a lot of grinding. But if you're a fan of Final Fantasy, or Japanese roleplay games in general, you already know that going into this collection. I can't say there's a lot of genre diversity, as these are all games from the same series. But is the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster Bundle worth your time and money? That really depends on how much you enjoy the Final Fantasy series, and if you don't already have other versions of these games, as the PlayStation Portable had better versions of Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 4, and the Game Boy Advance had better versions of Final Fantasy 5 and 6, along with acceptable versions of Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 4. The only game in this collection that I think truly succeeds on being the definitive version of itself is Final Fantasy 3, as prior to this collection, the only official way to play Final Fantasy 3 in English was on the Nintendo DS. And that version was so heavily changed that it bears almost no resemblance to its original form. So if you've been a longtime fan of Final Fantasy and have other remakes of these games already, I would only recommend buying the Final Fantasy III Pixel Remaster for $18. But if you're lacking ways to play these games conveniently, then I would absolutely recommend the Pixel Remasters, as these are the most accessible way to play these games currently. They may lack some of the content and enhancements that other remakes have received, but they are still perfectly serviceable versions. I do think charging $75 for this collection is a bit much. However, you are getting 6 games, with the shortest of them being 20 hours, with the longer games here running to the 60 to 80 hour mark. So yes, I do recommend the Final Fantasy Pixel Remasters overall. However, I personally would wait for a sale when you could get this collection for $60 or less. Please do subscribe, comment, like, and tell your friends.